It began with a whisper. Spring 2022. Blackridge Women's Correctional Facility, tucked away in the swamps of northern Florida, was the kind of place the world forgot until it couldn't anymore. Behind the razor wire, locked steel doors, and rusted gates, time didn't pass so much as it decayed. The women who lived there weren't just imprisoned. They were buried beneath silence, routine, and the belief that no one on the outside gave a damn what happened to them. But then, something shifted. It started with a single medical report. 24-year-old Tiana Brooks was sent to the infirmary after complaining of nausea and fatigue. She thought it was a stomach bug, the flu, maybe even food poisoning. But the nurse on duty took one look at her symptoms and ran a test. The results? Positive. She was 8 weeks pregnant. Now, on its own, that might seem like just another medical event behind prison walls. Inconvenient, maybe, but not earth-shattering. But it became something else the moment someone asked the obvious question. How? Because Tiana was in administrative segregation. Solitary. No contact visits. No male staff allowed inside her cell without a supervisor. She hadn't even been to the yard in months. So how in God's name was she pregnant? At first, the officials did what they always do when something goes wrong. They spun it. Maybe she was pregnant before intake, they said. Maybe the test was wrong. Maybe she lied. But then came the second report, and the third. By mid-June, 5 women in restricted housing, all under lockdown protocols, all with no male access, had tested positive for pregnancy. And that's when the whisper became a scream. All 5 of them said the same thing. I don't remember how it happened. I thought I was sick. I didn't consent to anything. The prison's response? Predictable. A tight-lipped press release from the Southern State Correctional Bureau claimed an internal review was underway. There is no current evidence of staff misconduct or protocol breaches, they insisted. But inside Blackridge, the women knew better. They felt it in their bones. Something was wrong. And one of them, one woman in particular, refused to let it go. Her name was Imani Carter. She was 27 years old, sharp-eyed, quiet, always watching, always thinking. She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She didn't play for sympathy. But when Imani found out she was pregnant and couldn't remember how or why, that was the moment something inside her broke. Or maybe something woke up. You see, Imani wasn't like the others. Before she was inmate number 428771, she had a name, a purpose, and a future that looked nothing like this. She had once been a nursing student at Liberty Heights Community College, full ride, pre-med. The girl with the textbooks, the tutor, the one her professors said had a shot. But life doesn't care about potential. And after her mother was diagnosed with late-stage lupus, after the prescriptions ran out and the electricity was cut off, Imani made a choice. She fell in with a pharmacist who offered her cash for forged prescriptions. Oxycodone, hydromorphone, the kind of drugs that kill slowly and silently. She wasn't running pills for thrills. She was running to keep the lights on, to keep her mother alive. But the DEA doesn't ask why. They found the burner phone, the text messages, the fake signatures. And they came in like ghosts, silent, cold, efficient. 12 years. No parole for 7. And just like that, the girl with the white coat dreams became a number on a beige jumpsuit. But prison didn't destroy Imani. It sharpened her. She spent her time working in the infirmary, learning, helping, watching. She kept her head down, but her eyes wide open. So when that test came back positive, when she sat in the exam chair, hands trembling, mind racing, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She clenched her jaw, dug her nails in her palms, and quietly, she began a plan. Because if someone had taken something from her, violated her, drugged her, used her like she didn't matter, then they picked the wrong woman. Imani Carter wasn't going to die quietly. Not in that prison. Not in that system. Not without leaving behind something they couldn't ignore. Before the jumpsuit, before the locked doors and plastic meal trays, Imani Carter was just a girl with a backpack full of nursing books and a dream far too big for the world she came from. She grew up in Liberty Heights, one of those zip codes the government forgets, until it's time for votes or prison beds. Her mother, June Carter, worked 2 jobs as a home health aide barely making ends meet. Her father? Just a name on a birth certificate, gone before she ever learned how to spell it. But Imani? She was the kind of kid who refused to disappear. At 16, she was tutoring classmates in biology and spending weekends volunteering at a free clinic. She wanted to understand the human body, not just memorize it. She wanted to save lives. Her teachers whispered, "She's med school material." Her mother whispered, "Just don't let this world swallow you." Then came the diagnosis. Her mother's lupus flared. Medications stacked up. Insurance failed. Imani watched the woman who raised her choose between insulin and electricity. And then one day, when she was 19, a soft-spoken pharmacist offered her a way out. A few pills, a few favors, a few forged signatures. It started small. But by 24, Imani was crossing county lines with prescription pads in her bag and survival on her conscience. She was caught, booked, sentenced. 12 years in Blackridge Women's Correctional Facility. But prison didn't erase who she was. Not really. Imani stayed sharp. She worked in the infirmary, took mental health courses, and never stopped watching. So when the symptoms began, the nausea, the fatigue, the dizzy spells, she thought maybe it was stress. Maybe it was anxiety. She hadn't seen a doctor in weeks. Hadn't even been touched. But when the nurse handed her the test results and said the word pregnant, Imani didn't speak. She couldn't. Her hands clenched so tight, her fingernails left half-moon cuts in her palms. How? When? Who? And worst of all, what did they do to me? That night, she didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of her tiny cell, mouth dry, heart pounding. And somewhere between lockdown checks and the hum of the overhead lights, a memory flickered to life. Not a full memory, just fragments. The silhouette of a man in uniform. A low humming noise. A strange taste in her mouth, metallic, bitter. Pressure. Darkness. Then nothing. When she woke up, the morning light was shining through the bars like nothing had changed. But something had, and now she was sure of it. That was the moment Imani Carter stopped being afraid. She knew what they wanted: silence. And she wasn't going to give it to them. She began keeping records. Notebooks weren't allowed. So she got creative. She wrote on scraps of tissue, the backs of crossword puzzles, even soap wrappers. She tracked who was on shift, what time trays were delivered, when the lights flickered, when she felt groggy. And she noticed a pattern. One name kept coming up. Darius Cole, a correctional officer with 6 years at Blackridge. Ex-military. Never raised his voice. Always helpful. Always polite. Too polite. He volunteered for night shifts. Worked alone. Lingered near cell block F longer than necessary. He brought Tylenol, not from a med station, but from his own pocket. And he looked at Imani like he was trying to read her mind, like he knew she remembered something and was waiting for her to crack. But she didn't. Instead, she started preparing. She faked illness to get access to the infirmary. She stole a small plastic vial used for specimen storage. She waited until she saw something barely visible on her bedsheet, and she used a cotton swab to collect it. She labeled the vial, tucked it into the hollow spine of her prison Bible. Then she wrote the letter. It was addressed to Carmen Duval, a civil rights attorney who had once visited Blackridge to speak about inmate abuse. Imani remembered her, sharp, kind, fearless. Someone who listened. The letter was detailed, precise. It described the pregnancies, the memory loss, the patterns, the fear, the man. And it ended with one devastating line. If something happens to me before this reaches you, please know this wasn't an accident. She folded the letter carefully, slid it into the outgoing legal mail pile, mail that was supposed to be protected, untouched by staff. But this was Blackridge, and rules here bent like old metal. Someone must have known she was getting too close. That night, Imani sat by her cell window and whispered Psalm 91 into the dark. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. She wasn't a religious woman. Not really. But those words, they helped her believe that maybe, just maybe, someone out there would hear her. Because the truth was already burning in her chest. And whether she lived to see it or not, she was going to make sure the world knew what happened. August 4th, 2022. A date that should have passed like any other inside Blackridge Women's Correctional Facility. Silent, suffocating, forgotten. But at exactly 3:18 a.m., something happened. The hallway camera outside cell block F, right outside Imani Carter's door, went dark. No warning, no explanation, just static. The glitch lasted 47 minutes. And by the time the feed returned, Imani was gone. Correctional Officer Darius Cole radioed it in just past 4 a.m. His voice? Steady. Controlled. Unit 4. I got a code blue. Inmate Carter is unresponsive. Possible suicide. Request medical assistance. That's how the report read. Clean. Clinical. Too clean. The official write-up? A masterclass in evasion. Inmate found hanging from upper bunk by bedsheet. Cell secured. No signs of struggle. Suicide note not recovered. Pronounced dead at 4:31 a.m. Case closed. Just another broken woman in a broken place. But those who knew Imani, they didn't believe it for a second. Because Imani Carter wasn't planning to die. She was planning to expose the truth. She had gathered evidence. Names. Dates. DNA. She had written a letter. She had lit a match. And now, suddenly she was gone? No. No one bought it. Not the other inmates. Not the infirmary staff. Not even the warden's secretary, who was overheard whispering near the intake files. That girl wasn't crazy. And one person, one very specific person, had reason to know this wasn't what it seemed. Her name was Elena Moore. Elena had been working as a nurse at Blackridge for just under a year. Fresh out of nursing school. Still new. Still hopeful. She took the job because no hospitals were hiring full-time. It was supposed to be temporary. A stepping stone. Just a paycheck. But Blackridge had a way of making temporary permanent. It had a way of swallowing your voice before you even realized you'd stop speaking. And then came Imani. Elena remembered the day Imani handed her a folded note. Quiet. Urgent. If anything happens to me, please make sure someone finds this. Elena didn't know what to say. She took the note, took the vial, tucked them in the back of a latex glove box in the infirmary drawer. And for the first time since taking the job, she was afraid. Not just afraid of what was happening. Afraid of who might be watching. Imani's body was found lying flat on the ground. Not suspended. There were marks on her neck, but not the kind left by a noose. They were fingerprints. Faint, but unmistakable. Signs of pressure, of force, of murder. Elena saw them when she arrived with the crash cart. Her hands shook. Her mouth went dry. But she said nothing. She checked the pulse, called the time, signed a form. Because inside Blackridge, speaking up didn't just cost you your job. It could cost you your life. The next morning, whispers moved through the prison like wildfire. Some women wept. Others just stared blankly at their walls. A few whispered what no one had the strength to say aloud. They killed her. She knew too much. She was trying to protect us. And they were right. Because while the prison tried to frame Imani's death as a tragic mental health event, one thing had already slipped beyond their control. Her letter had made it out. It had reached Carmen Duval. 3 days before Imani's death, Carmen opened an envelope at her law office in Tallahassee. It was marked legal mail. Inside, 3 pages, written in the tight, careful hand of a woman who had everything to lose. Carmen read it once, then twice, then stood up and grabbed her keys. She drove straight to the state capitol and filed a preliminary injunction against the Southern State Correctional Bureau. She demanded access, demanded transparency, and she brought the letter with her. If something happens to me, this wasn't an accident. That sentence didn't just rattle cages. It shattered them. By sundown, the headlines were already spinning. Mystery pregnancies in women's prison. Inmate found dead days after reporting abuse. And inside Blackridge, Darius Cole was beginning to sweat. Because the one woman who wasn't supposed to speak had spoken, loud enough for the world to hear. And Imani Carter's story was just beginning. When Carmen Duval stood before the press that week, letter in hand, she didn't shout. She didn't need to. The words spoke for themselves. If something happens to me before this reaches you, please know this wasn't an accident. By the next morning, that sentence was flashing across every local news station. And behind the gates of Blackridge Women's Correctional Facility, everything changed. No one said it out loud, Not yet. But they knew. Imani Carter had been silenced. And now, the truth was catching fire. Inside the prison, a quiet war had begun. Nurse Elena Moore stopped sleeping through the night. She replayed the moment over and over. Imani's eyes, the weight of that folded note, the faint bruises that didn't match the story. She knew what she had to do, but she also knew what it would cost. Blackridge wasn't a place for bravery. It was a place where courage got buried with the body. So Elena made a choice. She didn't speak yet, but she took photos. Quick, shaky shots of Imani's neck. The bruises. The way the body had been found, flat, not hanging. She copied her shift logs, retrieved the hidden vial, and tucked them all away in a sealed folder behind a box of gauze pads. She was done pretending. The time would come, and when it did, she would be ready. Whispers moved faster than the guards. Inmates began comparing stories they'd buried long ago. Tiana Brooks, Keisha Landry, a woman who refused to give her name. They each remembered fragments. I woke up bleeding. I thought it was a dream. He told me I'd never be believed. I didn't even know anything had happened until the test. And always, it came back to one man. Darius Cole. Tall, calm, decorated. A former Marine with a spotless record. The kind of man people believed. The kind of man who knew how to hide the monster underneath. But the cracks were showing. And outside, Carmen Duval was moving faster than anyone expected. On the morning of August 7th, Carmen arrived at Blackridge with a subpoena in one hand and 2 federal investigators at her back. She didn't knock. She didn't smile. She looked up at the main guard tower and whispered, "This place is about to collapse." Inside the prison, the tension was electric. Officers glanced over their shoulders. Inmates stood a little taller. Because finally, someone was listening. The investigation hit like a lightning strike. The federal team began pulling surveillance logs, interviewing inmates, analyzing food samples from the infirmary. And what they found was damning. Manual overrides on the hallway cameras, accessed using a guard's terminal. Traces of benzodiazepines, sedatives, detected in unopened food trays from Darius's shift. A partial DNA match found on the sample Imani had hidden in her Bible. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was undeniable. And then the walls cracked even wider. One guard, a soft-spoken veteran named Walter Grant, finally came forward. He looked tired, pale, like the guilt had been clawing at his insides for years. And when they sat him down, he didn't hesitate. Darius used to call it therapy, he said. Said they needed attention. Said they needed someone to make them feel human. Walter didn't report it. He looked away. Because that's how you survive in places like Blackridge. You don't make enemies. You keep your head down. But now his silence had a cost. A young woman was dead, and her blood was on the hands of every person who didn't speak when they could have. The arrest came fast. August 9th, 2022. Federal agents kicked down the door of Darius Cole's home at 5:23 a.m. They found his uniform bag hidden beneath his bed. Inside, soiled undergarments. A burner phone with unauthorized photos of sleeping inmates. And a handwritten notebook, cross-referencing medical logs with ovulation dates. It was meticulous. It was horrifying. And it was enough. When they put him in cuffs, he didn't resist. But as they walked him to the car, one officer asked the question that had been burning in every investigator's mind. Why? Why her? Darius didn't blink. Didn't flinch. He just whispered. She wasn't supposed to die. I just needed her quiet. That was the moment everything changed. Because this wasn't just about Imani anymore. This was about every woman he'd hurt. Every voice that had been silenced. Every system that looked the other way. And now the fire was burning too fast to contain. To the outside world, Darius Cole was the model correctional officer. 6 years on the job. Military background. No formal complaints. Flawless on paper. He held doors open. Volunteered for night shifts. Kept his uniform pressed and his voice calm. But behind that polished exterior lived a predator who knew exactly how to hide in plain sight. And to Imani Carter, he had a face. To the women of Blackridge Prison, he had a pattern. And to Nurse Elena Moore, he was no longer a question. He was the answer. Elena remembered the first time she met him. He seemed helpful, friendly, said all the right things, joked about the slow rhythm of prison life, offered to carry supplies. He made her feel safe. But now every memory felt like a red flag she'd ignored. The subtle warnings. The time her meal disappeared after she asked about medical logs. The way he stared, just a little too long, when she hesitated to sign something. She had wanted to believe he was harmless. But Imani's bruises, Imani's letter, Imani's death, made her see the truth. And then he cornered her. It was late. Past lights out. The hallway was empty. The infirmary dim. He stepped in front of her. Close. Too close. I know you've been talking, he said. They're not going to believe some little nurse over a decorated officer. His eyes were wide. Wild. Keep your mouth shut if you want to keep that license. Elena froze. Her pulse roared in her ears. But she didn't speak. Didn't cry. Didn't run. She just stared back and walked away. And when she returned to her quarters, she pulled out the photos, the logbook, the vial, and she made a call. The next morning, Carmen Duval walked back through the gates of Blackridge. She wasn't alone. 2 federal agents flanked her sides. She carried a subpoena, and in her bag, the final pieces of Imani's case. The photos Elena had taken, the sample Imani had preserved, and the log of events that mapped Darius's actions with military precision. She didn't announce her arrival, but every officer on shift that day felt it. Something was happening. Something big. Darius had always known how to play the game. He kept his record spotless, stayed out of trouble, smiled for the right people. But that morning, when Carmen entered with her investigators, the color drained from his face. Because he knew he'd lost control, federal agents began pulling surveillance footage, comparing logs, interviewing inmates in isolation. And one by one, the women began to speak. Tiana Brooks described waking up sore, without her underwear. Keisha Landry talked about haunting dreams, someone holding her down. Another woman, too afraid to use her name, said Darius used to bring her hot cocoa at night. She'd drink it, feel dizzy, and wake up with no memory. They all had different stories, but the details were chillingly the same. No consent, no memory, no one to believe them, until Imani. And yet, Darius still believed he'd get away with it, because he'd seen it before. Officers investigated, accused, transferred quietly, cases sealed, complaints ignored. But this time, he'd made a mistake. He hadn't just preyed on vulnerable women. He killed one, and she'd left a paper trail. Back in the infirmary, Elena took a deep breath. She handed over everything. Her logs, her photos, the vial Imani had hidden in her Bible. And when asked why she waited, her answer was quiet, but it cracked the room open. Because every woman I've seen try to speak up in this system either disappears or dies. That statement alone was enough. Enough to shake the walls of Blackridge. Enough to turn suspicion into certainty. Enough to make Darius Cole's badge worthless. Because the man in the uniform, the man who walked those halls like he owned them, he was done hiding, and the world was finally watching. When they took Darius Cole into custody, he didn't shout. He didn't plead. He just looked down and smiled. A quiet, crooked smile. The kind that says, "You're too late." But what Darius didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his empire of silence was already crumbling. And the flood was coming for every single brick. The evidence mounted faster than even the most seasoned investigators expected. Inmate testimony was just the beginning. Federal forensic teams recovered deleted surveillance data from the glitch that night, August 4th. 2 hallway cameras, disabled manually, accessed using a guard's ID code. Darius's code. They found override logs, time-stamped to his shift. Then came the food tray analysis. Unopened packets from Darius's rounds tested positive for benzodiazepines, sedatives powerful enough to knock someone unconscious without a trace. But the most damning evidence? The partial DNA match on the cotton swab Imani had hidden inside her Bible. It was irrefutable. Her last act was the one that brought the whole system to its knees. And then, finally, someone broke. Officer Walter Grant, the same man who once stood by and watched Darius cross every line, finally confessed. His voice was hoarse when he sat down in that cold interview room. He used to brag about it, Walter said. Said he was helping them. Said it wasn't rape if they didn't remember. He swallowed hard. I knew it was wrong. But in this place, you don't snitch. You don't speak. You survive. That single statement was enough to trigger a firestorm of disciplinary action. Within days, 2 more staff members were named in the investigation. A medical aide who helped falsify drug test results. A kitchen supervisor who altered delivery logs. They all thought they were safe. But Imani's story changed everything. On August 14th, federal agents raided Darius's apartment. What they found made even the most hardened officers sick. A burner phone filled with photos of unconscious women in prison cells. Stolen undergarments, labeled with initials. A handwritten notebook, cross-referenced with inmate medical records. Ovulation cycles. Drug doses. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, planned, predatory. When confronted, Darius stayed silent until they read Imani's letter out loud. The one she wrote when she knew death was coming. If something happens to me, this wasn't an accident. And for the first time, the mask slipped. He looked up, eyes sunken, and whispered, "She wasn't supposed to die. I just needed her quiet." But Imani Carter had never been quiet. Even in death, her voice thundered louder than any guard's command. Because the world was listening now. And it didn't stop there. The state launched an emergency review of Blackridge Women's Correctional Facility. And what they found was devastating. Over 120 complaints of sexual misconduct in the last 5 years. Only 4 had resulted in disciplinary action. Most were lost, dismissed, or under review. Cameras? Broken. Logs? Forged. Inmate records? Manipulated. It was never just one predator. It was a system designed to protect power, not people. And in the middle of it all were the women. Tiana Brooks, 6 months pregnant, stood in front of a press conference, hands trembling on her belly. He told us we were animals, that nobody cared what happened in here. But I remember everything now. I remember waking up bleeding. I remember the sound of his belt. And now this child inside me will never know his name. And thank God for that. Her words silenced the crowd. No one blinked, not even a judge, because that kind of truth, you don't look away from it. And back inside the courtroom, the prosecution built their case brick by brick. Carmen Duval held up Imani's logbook, page after page of dates, times, names. Elena Moore, her voice shaking, described Imani's final days, the fear, the pressure, the choice to fight. And Walter Grant, head bowed, admitted what the system always feared most. We all knew. We just didn't do anything. But now, they had no choice, because the wall was falling. By the end of that week, Darius Cole had been charged with 5 counts of sexual assault, 2 counts of conspiracy to obstruct justice, 1 count of second-degree murder, and multiple counts of misconduct in a correctional facility. He faced life without parole. He had started as the man no one suspected. He ended as the man no one would ever forget. And the woman he tried to silence? She became the reason the silence shattered. October 16th, 2022. It had been 73 days since Imani Carter was found dead in her prison cell. And on that crisp morning in Leon County Circuit Court, justice finally stepped into the room. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, survivors, former inmates sat shoulder to shoulder with legal observers. Some held candles. Others clutched photos. But all of them came for one reason: to make sure Imani wasn't forgotten. Darius Cole entered in shackles. No longer the polished officer. No longer the man in control. He wore a cheap gray suit that hung loose on his shoulders. His face looked thinner, paler, and for once, he didn't smile. Because the game was over. Prosecutor Elena Graves didn't waste time. Her opening line struck like lightning. This case is not about sex. It's not about love. It's about power. A correctional officer used his badge, his routine, and his access to prey on women locked in cages. Women who could not say no, who were ignored when they tried to scream. And when one of them, Miss Imani Carter, dared to expose him, he silenced her, permanently. The defense? Predictable. They painted Darius as misunderstood, claimed the women were confused, said Imani was emotionally unstable, a troubled inmate looking for attention. But the jury? They weren't buying it, because the evidence spoke louder than spin. Federal analysts confirmed that the hallway cameras were disabled using Darius's unique login. Chemical tests found sedatives, benzodiazepines, in food trays delivered on his rounds. A forensic lab confirmed Darius's DNA on the cloth sample Imani had hidden in her Bible. And then came the images. 2 low-resolution stills, recovered from a corrupted backup drive. They showed Darius walking in his cell block F, after hours, alone, carrying a syringe and a folded bedsheet. He wasn't scheduled for any rounds that night, but Imani was found dead hours later. Then came the voices. Tiana Brooks stood 6 months pregnant, hands on her belly, eyes locked on Darius. You said no one would believe us. You called us animals, said our voices didn't matter. But I remember now, and I want you to know this child growing inside me. He'll never know your name, and thank God for that. Several jurors wiped away tears. Even the judge paused to collect herself. And then, finally, Darius cracked. On the 7th day of trial, cornered by the weight of his crimes, abandoned by his defense team, and unable to deny what had been laid bare, he took the stand. At first, he deflected, blamed prison culture, claimed the women wanted attention, that Imani was obsessed. But then Carmen Duval stood, and she read Imani's letter, word for word. If something happens to me, this wasn't an accident. And in the silence that followed, Darius looked down and whispered, she wasn't supposed to die. I just wanted her quiet. It took the jury less than 3 hours. They returned with a unanimous decision. Guilty on 5 counts of sexual assault. Guilty of conspiracy to obstruct justice. Guilty of second-degree murder. Guilty of misconduct in a correctional facility. Darius Cole was sentenced to life in prison without parole. When asked if he had any final words, he simply said, I hope they forgive me, but I don't expect them to. No one replied, because some sins can't be forgiven, only exposed. Outside the courthouse, Carmen Duval stepped in front of the cameras. Her voice cracked, but her words landed like stone. Imani Carter was not just an inmate. She was a truth teller, a whistleblower, a daughter, a woman who begged us to believe her, and we were too late. But today she won. The trial made national headlines, but its real impact came weeks later. In January 2023, the state legislature passed a sweeping new law. It was called Imani's Law, and it changed everything. Under Imani's Law, all high-risk prison units must have 24/7 functional surveillance cameras. DNA must be preserved in all inmate assault cases. Third-party oversight boards were established to review all misconduct complaints. And for the first time, prison staff and inmates received legal whistleblower protection. It was unprecedented. It was powerful. It was overdue. And it bore her name. Imani didn't live to see it passed, but she was the reason it existed at all. Imani Carter died behind steel bars. But her voice? It broke through. It echoed, and it shook the very walls meant to contain it. In the weeks after Imani's law passed, everything changed. Other states took notice. New York, California, Maryland, Illinois, all launched their own investigations into women's correctional facilities. Civil rights groups flooded phone lines. Nonprofits reported a 300% increase in hotline calls from incarcerated women. Stories, long buried, finally came to light. The dam had broken, and Imani Carter was the one who cracked it open. Tiana Brooks gave birth in May 2023. A healthy baby boy. She named him Noah Elijah. Elijah, she said, because I want him to be a voice for the voiceless. Like Imani, Tiana was granted early release under a clemency order. Today, she works with a nonprofit that helps children born to incarcerated mothers. Keisha Landry, another survivor, was moved to a rehabilitation center and reunited with her daughter. She still has nightmares, but now she's healing. Imani saved us, she told reporters, even when we didn't believe we were worth saving. And Elena Moore? She never returned to Blackridge. She left her nursing job, changed her number. She was praised by some, threatened by others. Her tires were slashed. Her license was audited. Twice. But she never backed down. Today, she speaks at correctional ethics conferences. She trains trauma-informed medical professionals. And in a drawer at her home, she keeps Imani's original logbook. Sometimes she opens it, not to read it, just to remember what courage looks like. Warden Richard Mallory, the man in charge of Blackridge, was never criminally charged. But he was quietly removed 6 months after the trial. In a leaked exit interview, he reportedly said, "There are things you don't see when you don't want to." That quote would later appear in a New York Times editorial titled, "The Eyes That Chose Not to See." Imani's body went unclaimed for weeks. Her mother had passed. Her brother was in recovery. Her remains sat in a cold drawer at the county morgue. Until Carmen Duval stepped in. She petitioned the court, arranged a memorial service. And on a rainy Saturday morning in Miami, more than 200 people gathered to say goodbye. Former inmates, advocates, nurses, strangers. At the center of the room stood a sign, written in black marker. She told the truth. They killed her for it. But she won. That wasn't the end. Because months after the trial, more women came forward. Some had been too afraid to testify. Some had been deported, forgotten. One was Maria Velasquez, an undocumented woman who'd served 6 years for a nonviolent offense. She told her story quietly, through tears. "I never said anything. I thought no one would care. But when I read about Imani, I found my voice." She was granted protection under a new whistleblower asylum clause. Another was Tina Holloway, a former inmate who had reported abuse 2 years prior. But her paperwork mysteriously vanished. After Imani's story went public, her case was reopened. For the first time, someone listened. Even Ronnie Jackson, a transgender woman once placed in solitary confinement, sent a handwritten letter. "I never met her, but I heard what she did, and I've started writing too. Because of her, maybe someone will believe me." Today, inside women's prisons across the country, you'll see things you never would have before. Cameras that actually work. Emergency panic buttons in high-risk units. Posters detailing inmate rights in multiple languages. And on some of those posters, there's a name. Imani Carter. 6 months after the trial, Carmen Duval received a letter. No return address. Just a single paragraph, scribbled in shaky handwriting. "They say you helped the girl from Florida. The one they called Imani. I never met her. But the women here still talk about her. They say she wrote everything down. So now, I'm writing too." Carmen folded the letter carefully, placed it in Imani's file, and whispered, "Your story's not over." Imani Carter didn't have power. She didn't have a title. She didn't have a lawyer. Not at first. What she had was a voice. And even when they tried to erase her, even when they buried her in silence, she spoke. And that voice, it didn't just echo. It built a movement. It wrote a law. It made the world listen. She died behind bars, but she broke the walls wide open. And now, no one can silence her again.